The terms of the first part of this course are really set by Epicurus, and the first three readings are really dominated by that Epicurean claim about death. The force of that is, I think, very strong, and to some degree is something that the rest of the course is struggling with, either trying to overcome explicitly or come to terms with at least, and that is the Epicurean claim that death is not an experience of life. That is, that when we are, death has not yet come, and when death comes, we are not, so that it's at least nothing to us in the sense that it is not something that will be part of our experience, because it's the end of all experience, and that would seem to directly imply that if it's nothing to us, it's neither good nor bad, so it's definitely not bad. Um, the second two, the second readings, the second and third reading by Nagel and now by authors Brueckner and Fischer are, you might say, attempts to recapture or to legitimate the so-called natural view that death is something bad, and so the widely shared, perhaps even common sense assumption that death is bad, and to give it some philosophical grounding. We saw that what Nagel was struggling with, of course, was how do you call something bad if it's not something that's actually experienced? That is, he concedes the Epicurean point that death is not an experience of life, yet wants to be able to claim with reason that even though it's not an experience of life, we can say rationally, we can say sensibly that when someone dies, something bad has happened to them, and that death, therefore, is a bad. And we saw that his strategy for doing that was to really look very closely at the conditions under which we say that a bad thing in general has happened to someone, and to try to describe those conditions in such a way that they would include death. So, that, of course, they would have to include bads that are not actually directly experienced by the subject of the evil, the one to whom the bad thing has happened. And I would say that, looking at Nagel's essay, that is really the major concern, is trying to establish the conditions under which we can say that something bad has happened to someone, to include things that are not directly experienced by that person, and therefore for death. And that's really what Nagel's concerned with. But he does mention in passing the so-called asymmetry problem, the problem that was discussed by Lucretius in the ancient world, a follower of Epicurus, who said that death is non-existence. Death is not being. And so is not being born not being. There was an endless time, an eternity before we were born, and really, in that sense of being non-being or non-existent, it is indistinguishable from the non-being of having died. And so to think of death in the typical way, to regret death or to fear death, consider death an evil thing, one would have to, if one wanted to be consistent, also consider the time before we were born as a bad thing, a time an evil had occurred or was occurring to us. And no one thinks like that. No one thinks that somehow or another, no one regrets their what will be called in this essay, their prenatal non-existence. They consider their posthumous, post-death, posthumous non-existence a bad thing, but not their prenatal non-existence. So I guess the Epicurean or Lucretian message is, get it straight here. You're going to regret the one thing, you should regret the other. You don't regret the one thing, prenatal non-existence, so you shouldn't regret the other. Of course, both Nagel and Brueckner and Fischer are concerned with overcoming that claim that it is fundamentally irrational, fundamentally inconsistent to treat these things asymmetrically. That is, to treat the one differently than the other. Both of them want to provide some reason that would justify our treating them asymmetrically, treating them differently, treating non-existence that follows death as being something bad, while we don't consider necessarily the non-existence that precedes birth as something. But that was not the major focus of Nagel. That was something that was dealt with very cursorily in Nagel, uh, the asymmetry problem. And it is much more thematic in this essay, Why is Death Bad, by Brueckner and Fischer. Although they very, of course, the essay takes its prompt from Nagel's essay, and is concerned with the same sort of problems that Nagel was, having to do with the non-experience. The notion that death is not something experienced, though this essay still is working within the world of discourse. It's created by Epicurus. We'll see later in the course that we have authors who want to break out of those strictures that Epicurus put on the the sensible discussion of death. But so far, I would say that this essay is squarely within that space, and it's certainly not trying to argue that we do experience death. It's assuming that Epicurus is right in that respect, that death is something that is not experienced human being, so it accepts that problematic. But like Nagel wants to prove something, and something that's very limited, that is the Epicurean background of the non-experience of death is assumed, and something very narrow and limited is what is issued here and what they're trying to establish, and that is that given that stricture, that we can still sensibly say that death is a bad thing if we want to. But there's some grounds for saying it's a bad thing, and this essay again is explicitly directed to the so-called asymmetry problem, and that's something that, it's a technological jargon, there's lots of technological jargon in this essay, but it's, once you familiarize yourself with it, it's easily mastered. There's nothing incredibly difficult about it, but you should, know what the asymmetry problem is. And you should feel comfortable using those expressions, although they may not trip off the tongue. Prenatal non-existence and posthumous non-existence. Again, they're just words. There's no reason to explain it in exactly those words. And it's a good thing to be able to just explain what they mean, right? Put them in common speech. But in any case, okay, so it's the asymmetry problem, which is what it's issued. What is at issue here? At the beginning of the essay, they sort of rehash the same ground that Nagel is over, having to do with this problematic of the non-experience of death. They say at the bottom of the first page, which is page 213, if death can be a bad thing for a person, though not in virtue of including unpleasant experiences of that person, then death is a bad thing for a person in a way that is different from the way in which, say, pain is a bad thing for a person. This is important for them to set this up for some of the points they're going to make later on. That is, some things which are bad or evil for a person, such as pain, are experienced as bad by the person, whereas other things which are bad for a person, such as death, are not ever experienced as bad by the person. Death, then, is assimilated to such bads as betrayal by a friend behind one's back, which, though never experienced as bad, one never finds out, and suffers no bad consequences, are nevertheless bad for a person. I think they're just acknowledging that they agree with Nagel's argument in his essay Death, that you can think of death profitably as being in a kind of a family of bads, like being deceived by friends and never finding out about it, that some things that we would say are bad things that happen to someone are not things that they actually experience, become aware of in any way, or even suffer any actual pains or any kind of bad consequences as a result. But then, they refer to the, well, they then say, well, okay, death could be an experiential blank. Death could then be an experiential blank and still be a bad thing for an individual. And one plausible explanation of why this is so is that death, though an experiential blank, is a deprivation of the good things of life. And that's more or less Nagel's overall view. That, as he says, death is not bad because of any of its positive features. Death is bad because of the goods that it deprives us of. So they're sort of assuming the general validity of Nagel's argument here, but then differing with him on one point, one key point for them, and that is his solution to the asymmetry problem. After explaining the asymmetry problem on page 214, they say at the bottom of page 214, one way to respond to the challenge and thus defend the Nagelian explanation of death's badness is to say that whereas one could logically have lived longer, it is logically impossible that one should have been born much earlier. This notion that we can say that we're deprived of future goods by death because we can say that although we die at time t, we could have died at time x later and further into the future, and therefore we're deprived of all of the good things that happened between time t and the later time x. However, we can't logically, coherently say that we were deprived in any way because we were born later than we were. We cannot say, well, I was born at time x, and I could have been born earlier at time t, and therefore was deprived of all the goods between time x and t. But that's logically impossible because we would be different people. It wouldn't be me, I guess I'm talking about. Had I been born much earlier, Nagel says, I would not be me, and therefore I am the basis of my regret of those supposed lost goods that I was deprived of because I was born later than I could have been. It doesn't really make any sense. So, as they say, the claim is that it is irrational or impossible to regret that a proposition which is necessarily false isn't true. But they say this response is unsatisfying. Is it really, does Nagel really dismiss it in this way? Well, they say that at the very least, the notion that I could not have been born much earlier than I was and be the same person is at least contestable. And it's not obviously true, and therefore can't stand as an assumption. It is not at all clear, for instance, that Socrates, the very same Socrates, couldn't logically have come into being 10 years earlier than he in fact did. Why exactly should, roughly, the actual time of one's birth be an essential property of a person? That is, we don't normally think that an essential property of a particular person is the date or time of birth. We may say other things are essential properties of people, that is, properties that make them what they are, make them the particular being that they are, and without which they would be something else. We don't normally think of the date of one's birth, time of one's birth, as being such a feature. So it at least is not obviously true, what Nagel says. So they say, page 215, the first paragraph, the explanation will not, this is Nagel's explanation, the explanation will not be acceptable to anyone who denies the assumption if it is at least logically possible that one should have been born much earlier, and no reason has been offered to rule this out, then we still need to develop a response to the challenge raised by Epicurus and Lucretius. That is, that the asymmetry problem, the problem of whether there's any real rational basis for treating the non-existence after death differently than the non-existence before birth, is still hanging there and still valid. And so what they're going to do is to provide their explanation of why it is indeed rational and legitimate to treat these two instances of non-existence asymmetrically.